Thanks, Albert. Obviously, very strong words in regards to the aspirations, and obviously we're mindful of that potential development of the North. So hence, I think we've foreseen that development coming, and I'll talk about I suppose the Kimberley Saltwater Science Project now itself. So back in 18 months ago, obviously the project, it is one of the last WAMSI projects to get off the ground. Obviously, we'll touch on that a bit about that a little bit more. Obviously, so the Kimberley Indigenous Saltwater Science Project in 2012, initial engagement with traditional owners in the Kimberley was very difficult. It got off to a bit of a shaky start. So then back in 2015, then a workshop in Broome was called to discuss the future of the project. But prior to that, Patrick Sears, the previous WAMSI CEO, contacted Patrick Dodson at Yawuru, and Pat was Senator Dodson was the CEO at Yawuru at the time, and asked Senator Dodson if he could write a letter to the 7 traditional owner groups and ask them to try and rethink about how we could participate in the WAMSI 1.5 project around traditional knowledge. So all Kimberley groups were invited, and we're able to hold a meeting in Broome to discuss about how do we want to implement this project. And with full credit to the group, the reference group at the time thought about, well, how do we turn this around to work for us? We know that research in the Kimberley is very costly and expensive, and to travel within the Kimberley is quite costly and expensive. So it was decided that we'd look at forming an advisory group, and obviously with some secretariat support, and look at, I suppose, developing the objectives that would obviously, I suppose, achieve and deliver some of the things that we sort of foresee. So 2016, the group was formed, and hence over the last 18 months, we've been tirelessly working with the research group. So the Kimberley Indigenous Saltwater Science Project was overall aim of improving the way in which research involving traditional owners and science community is planned, assessed and undertaken in the Kimberley Saltwater Country. It is funded by the West Australian Marine Science Institute and steered by representatives from Balangara, Wunambulgambara, Dambi Mangari, Bari Jawi, Nyulnyul, Yawuru, and the Garayati people. The project is supported by the Darwin University and the University of West Australia, Yambaburu Yawuru, and Mosaic Environmental and Kimberley Land Council. So the KISS objectives, obviously, I said full credit to the group. So we decided to look at how can we, what are the key concerns that the Indigenous people sitting at the table had. One of them is around integration of traditional knowledge and Western science together to protect marine conservation and management. And objective 2 was to develop a standard and agreed community protocols and research agreement template to underpin marine research in the Kimberley and implementation of a strategy to build awareness in the science community for the need of this engagement. So at the time, a lot of traditional owners were concerned about the number of marine research and researchers entering country without them of any formal notice or any engagement. So one was to develop a set of standard protocols that would step through that process of how someone could engage and undertake that engagement in a collaboration with traditional owners. Objective 3 was to develop a framework and protocols for standardizing data collection, storage and analysis methodologies that can be used to monitor saltwater country across the Kimberley. So a standardized sort of operating procedure where we could look at measuring across the Kimberley with our ranger groups. A lot of ranger groups are collecting data and information now, but we want to make that more meaningful, I suppose. How does that feed back into management? This includes a sort of a triangle package of research agreed targets and delivery to rangers, develop internal capacity. So it's about capacity building as well. One thing we wanted was that when researchers come and work with traditional owners, we wanted them to leave a legacy, and that was, the legacy was the tools, and so that traditional owner group rangers could keep going and implement those research projects that they've undertaken in a collaborative process with the researchers. So for further, I suppose, monitoring of country. One of that was, I suppose, if you look at it, the drop-down camera process with the Dambi Mangari guys sort of and developed and developed in a way that was more suitable to them. So, so the working group research approach led by the KISS working group. It was, as a working group really sort of put their heads down and really wanted to sort of deliver something that was meaningful in the end. Rangers would be sourced to facilitate workshops, so we ensured there was some money there to for the POs to participate, and the agenda of who to invite and attend the venue with workshops. There were 7 on-country workshops, roughly about 103 traditional owner groups, traditional owners participated in those 7 on-country workshops. And in 2016, the working group workshop in Broome, obviously a lot of group. So the 2017 working group workshop, I suppose that what we did was, how do we pull this together was we had some workshops in Broome, but would constantly have a monthly phone hookup and invite researchers that were undertaking their research in the Kimberley to sort of give some findings back through that process. And working group, I suppose, was feeding back that information through to the PBCs at the same time. So research team, the selection process. So previous working relationships that we had with the researchers. So UWA undertook some research in the Kimberley, had a good relationship. This is about trust as well. So we sort of felt that we'd worked with some researchers previously and that trust was already embedded in the process. So I think that's I suppose, a important part of this is trust and building in a collaborative relationship is having trust with one another. I suppose, once the objectives were set, expressions of interest were put out for those objectives. So the group decided to pick the research team based around their experience working in those particular fields. So it was based on strength-based research that was selected in the team. So full credit to Beau Austin, obviously Charles Darwin University, Kathy Robinson and Stephen Garnett. We thought that Charles Darwin University, with their work with traditional owners in the Northern Territory, was probably the best team to deliver the traditional knowledge component. Objective 2 was to sort of develop a standardized agreed protocols, and we thought the KLC and through Gina Lincoln, the KLC had the REACT process already established, and we thought, well, that was, I suppose, the best place to start with, to develop a set of guidelines in regards to protocols for engagement. So what we did was sort of subtly adopt those, the REACT process, and obviously with traditional owner groups putting their, I suppose, input into it, because people want to be contacted in regards to any work that was done in their country. So those protocols for engagement sort of tie into that. And the other objective was 3 was to develop a standardized framework for protocols and data collection, storage, analysis that can monitor saltwater country. And the other third project was to include development of a training package for agreed research targets and delivery to rangers. So it's about tools. And what we come up was, I suppose, with that's the matrix that obviously with the 3 components coming together, and obviously they feed into what we see as a healthy country, a healthy saltwater country for people into the future. Some of that, excuse me, the acknowledgements. Acknowledge the traditional owners, 103 of them, 103, I suppose, in total, but obviously the traditional owner groups that obviously you can see within that landscape. The working group below, obviously the 7 reference group members. WAMSI, I'd like to thank Stu and Kelly for their, I suppose, commitment and support over the last 18 months. And the research team, Charles Darwin University, CSIRO, UWA, KLC, and Mosaic. So we'll obviously talk a bit more about the products itself. and I'll hand it over to researchers to lead this part. Questions or? Yeah, I'm easy. I'm just mindful of time, so I haven't got the bell yet, so that's pretty good.
These guys wanted to present as a group just to show the united front of the project. But if there are questions maybe on either of those for Albert or Dean for those first sections, feel free. Otherwise, we can continue on, and I'll certainly be here for morning tea and things like that. So, are there any questions at this stage about? Yeah.
I see the collaboration aspect of it being wonderful. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you envision these thinking a little bit better? And for instance, having a type of scenario that would have the Kimberley Land Council, for example, actually providing training for government employees and stakeholders, training and some type of certification by way of indigenous mentorship to us in government that comes directly from you. So you would be certifying us to be ready to go and be researching the country.
Yeah, I mean, one of those, through that process is any researcher, we're trying to, I suppose, identify and deal with that at the moment is we're just trying to establish a process that through the joint management of Yawuru, the joint management program, that any researcher or any team that sort of works on Yawuru country could go through a Yawuru cultural immersion program. So it's about building that cultural awareness package. So is that what you're sort of alluding to? Yeah.
Have indigenous people as the mentors.
Yeah, I think this is that future. This is ultimately, obviously, that discussion around how do we obviously transfer knowledge in an equal footing. You know, obviously, one thing that we all identify and understand is that Indigenous knowledge is sometimes not recognized as science and science process, and so it's overlooked or undervalued in some cases. And I guess what we're trying to do now is obviously develop the understanding that, you know, it can be obviously compatible with science and knowledge, and the traditional knowledge aspect is compatible with science, and it actually is compatible with I guess management, you know, structures and processes. And I think this is an example of that future that you're talking about. And ultimately, some of the tools that are being produced through this project and through the efforts of all involved is ultimately going to create a platform for us to really step into that space and to, you know, not only deliver that, you know, support and training from a scientific perspective, but also start to really integrate that as part of scientific, you know, standard operating procedures and training as well. So.
Yeah, I suppose through the protocols for engagement, that actually forces the researcher to contact the traditional owner group and build that collaboration research and build a trust amongst yourselves. So it's about you contacting the group with your proposal and building that relationship with them. It's about enforcing that. So it enforces you to engage with the traditional owner group in regards to your research, and how can the research complement each other. It's about outcomes that both, I suppose, meet your requirements and then the requirements of the traditional owner group. But that protocol for engagement process does force you to engage with the group in regards to what you want to research in regards to their area. So it forces you to build that relationship one-on-one. So
just quickly, sorry, when I was here 2 years ago, when they actually launched the blueprint, I think nobody in this room had an idea as to what traditional ecological knowledge was. And it was really, really exciting for WAMSI, you know, dedicating obviously an effort and an action behind accommodating a space and facilitating a table to actually have the conversation around what it actually means and what it can mean to science and researchers. And so when we're talking about the future is here, it's now. We've already started that 2 years ago, and I think that's sort of why we're here today, is so that we continue to have that discussion.
Just to continue that discussion then, so if people want to contact
those owners? Is that the slide that you had previous to those that contact people, or go through WAMSI, or what are those?
We're going to go. So that's going to be that's the next. You're preempting the next talk, but that will be spoken about the process. And I think following on from that previous one, there has been discussion about a certified program. So how do you do that across country rather than having to go to every group for 3 days? How do we sort of incorporate a way to educate scientists on how the appropriate way? And that's something that's being discussed as well. So that's sort of coming. Are there any others just from what we've discussed so far? Otherwise, we might progress on, because some of your questions may be answered with the NESFIT, which is why we're trying to incorporate it. I think it's probably worthwhile pointing out too, Rhonda Murphy, who's from the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, so it's always still enough.
I'm in the attraction section.
She's the attractions. She is our attraction. Yeah. So Rhonda and her team have been developing education programs for educating the department on how do you operate, how do you work with Indigenous people, and they're working from down in the south mainly. But we were talking to these guys about how that could be combined with some of the Kimberley work to make sure we've got some standard approaches across WA. So there's so many researchers in Perth that can. CSIRO has one as well at the moment. They have a cultural education program too. So there is the beginnings of those sorts of things going forward. So I think we might move on to the next presentation and might answer some of those questions that you're thinking about, and we can have a much bigger question session at the end. So is that all for Beau? So I'll pass on to Beau Austin and Albert to continue on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stu, and thanks Dean and Albert for a really good introduction to give context to the work that we did. I think on that point too is that there's a lot of diversity amongst Indigenous people in the Kimberley as well, so it's kind of not as simple as finding a one-size-fits-all solution to establishing these dialogues. And I think that word dialogue is probably key, that dialogue between people in Perth and other places outside of the Kimberley and local traditional owners is the key to making these relationships work. So we're certainly making some progress in that regard. Today, I'll talk about the part of the project Objective 1 that I was given the task of in 18 months to integrate Indigenous knowledge and Western science and have that job done. And I guess one of the first things that we discussed and that we've learned over many years, I've been working only 10 years in Northern Australia. These guys have been working lifetimes. It's not a job that can be completed. Bringing Indigenous knowledge and Western science together is not a job that you can tick off and say it's done. It's a process. It's ongoing. It's lived. It's part of our relationships and our collaborative work. So I just thought I'd put up a first slide to a lot of the questions that I get from some of the more sceptical colleagues of mine. Why mobilise Indigenous knowledge for collaborations in saltwater country in the first place? And these points here are some of the things that I jotted down. These guys might have some other ideas as well, but some of the key things are that Indigenous knowledge helps us to see changes, threats and connections between things that science might not. It offers a different perspective, a different way of looking at things, a different way of defining problems and working towards solutions. Indigenous, like we heard from Dean and Albert this morning, it's holistic. Country is holistic, country and people together. So if we want to think about environmental, social, cultural, economic and spiritual aspects of country, as well as all of the other aspects, which us non-Indigenous people, especially in the West, are starting to grapple with in thinking around social ecological systems and how to manage those for sustainability. Indigenous people are leaders in this, key practitioners in this space. It also helps us to support Indigenous people to look after their languages, their governance systems and their way of life, a way of moving towards practical reconciliation, I guess is a word that's used often. And it's a really key tool in that. As much as research and knowledge production can be colonising in effect, it can also help to deal with some of those problems if it's done well. Mixing Indigenous knowledge and Western science together, though difficult, can lead to some real innovation and some real impact. Impact in academic spheres as well as management on the ground. And one of the things that we heard kind of probably too regularly, actually, over the last 18 months and longer than that, is that the Kimberley coast is an under-researched place. We don't have enough knowledge about the Kimberley coast. Well, maybe in science there hasn't been enough science done, but there's been people living in those along that coastline for 60,000 years or something, and a lot of that knowledge is still there in practice. It's alive, it's current. So it's not really right to say that the Kimberley coast is under-researched. It's just that we're not mobilising all of the knowledge that can help us make decisions, good management decisions about the coast. Anything else that you'd like to add? No. The next slide, I might let Albert talk to this one.
Yeah, I didn't want to obviously repeat what you were saying, but obviously I think we share the same sentiment from both communities. I think as Indigenous people, we also, you know, these are some of the reasons why, and I think why mobilize Western science with our knowledge, with Indigenous knowledge. Some of the points was obviously we feel that it's an opportunity, you know, to gain more of a holistic and thorough understanding around the values that exist on saltwater country up in the Kimberleys. The second point was obviously we want to start to, you know, develop collaborative strategies that allow science to be more efficient and meaningful, especially when it comes to long-term management and sustainability. And the third point was obviously we need to develop the technical capacity to help Indigenous people to look after the country. And so this is just that example of evolution like we sort of touched on earlier on. And I think, you know, because of the Kimberley Ranger Network, it's provided a really good platform for science to really, set a standard, so to speak, for the rest of the, you know, for the rest of the world to sort of use as an example as to what can be possibly become world's best practice.
Yeah, so on this slide, I've just included some of the perspectives from traditional owners. We went around the Kimberley, Beck and I and a few other people in light aircraft, etc., and had workshops, conversations with people. And what we found was that there's an overwhelming sense of, I guess, openness towards science from traditional owners. Traditional owners are not anti-science. There was, out of the 100 or so people we spoke to, there was only very, very few people who said, no, we don't think science has a role to play in looking after country. Most said, we want science. We want science to help us to enrich the picture of country so that we can make better decisions. But we don't want science coming in under any old terms. It's a good process and good partnerships that we'll describe. So one of the things that traditional owners, I guess it was an exercise in good faith in some ways, and I'll explain why, but we asked traditional owners to give us some examples of Indigenous knowledge that people have currently for saltwater country. And the most common things that people spoke about were seasonal indicators, historical knowledge, knowledge of tides and currents, hunting, and all of the knowledge that goes along with that, location of cultural values, sites, boundaries, and the connections between those places, health indicators of both species and ecosystems, the connectivity between all of the different values on country, and risk management on country, how to travel safely through country, both from a physical safety, but also a spiritual safety as well. So that's really interesting, and traditional owners have been saying these sorts of things for a really long time, but they felt that it was important that, again, they expressed that this knowledge is alive and being practiced, and it's there ready to be mobilised in collaborative partnerships for research and for management. However, what we've kind of done through this process was, it was a conscious exercise in probably bad faith, really, because there's some serious limitations in doing this sort of stock take of Indigenous knowledge like we did. What that effectively does is turn Indigenous knowledge into a Western science object. And so that's not really the way that we should be engaging with Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is a lived, and that message was repeated over and over with our partners. It's as much about practicing country, managing country, living on country, relating to country as it is about knowing about country. And those things can't really be separated. And there's also a lot of things that are sort of intentionally left out because it's not for public consumption. So I'd put this cultural iceberg picture there, but really it's, I guess, a knowledge iceberg. The knowledge that we talk about, the knowledge as content, if you will, is only the tip of the iceberg. It's the surface. Underneath that, there's the practices and beliefs that inform all of the way we know the world altogether, science as well, Western science as well. I'll move quickly through. So the main product that I guess I developed with the team is a multiple evidence-based approach to collaborative research and management or knowledge production in the Kimberley. And we use the term evidence-based really to mean knowledge or information that can be used for decision-making, policy and management. I guess over the last decade or so of working with Indigenous people and Western scientists, we've started to get some pretty good ideas about, you know, this collaboration thing, a good feel for it, but it's really difficult to articulate. And I think this figure does it quite well. It's been developed by some colleagues in the Stockholm Resilience Centre, Maria Tango and others, and we're starting to apply it in different places around the world. So we introduced this concept to the Kimberley context and got traditional owner and the working group's feedback on this image, and they said it was pretty good. So what does it say? Essentially on the, how does this thing, oh, no, that's gone again. I don't know what the pointer is. Oh yeah, here we go. So on the right-hand side here, you've got a whole bunch of streams of knowledge systems flowing along as they do. You've got social science knowledge, natural science knowledge, technical knowledge, other transdisciplinary knowledges. Those things often run in parallel, or they converge, or they seem to flow along through time on any given topic. On the other side, you've got local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, practitioner knowledge, and traditional knowledge, these other non-scientific ways of knowing the world. And really, if we imagine taking a cross-section of these knowledge systems, maybe we're talking about saltwater country in the Kimberley, if we're only mobilising, say, one knowledge system, we get a particular picture painted of saltwater country. But the more knowledge systems we can mobilise, the more we can know about saltwater country. We develop an enriched picture of saltwater country and can make better management decisions, better policy, etc. I guess the key point for this is that each knowledge system speaks for itself and is validated by the knowledge holders themselves. And I'll move very quickly through the rest. We talked with traditional owners about how to implement a multiple evidence-based approach. We came up with a 4-step process and some really detailed guidelines for each of those steps. There's a lot of detail in the reports that we can go through. And really this is to support collaborations. It's to ensure that there's kind of a checklist or a way of keeping each other accountable, two-way accountability, I guess, to make sure that our partnerships are good ones and leading to the best outcomes. I won't go into that. There's a whole lot of tools that we've developed and tested over the years in different knowledge systems and together. And the final point I'd like to make, I guess, is that when we're talking about regional monitoring, developing a regional monitoring framework like Beck will talk about, or other regional scale knowledge collaborations, it really has to be something that proceeds with a lot of caution. There has to be a lot of free, prior and informed consent with the Indigenous people involved, because sharing knowledge is risky and it has implications for local people that some of us who live away from country might not really be aware of. So I think that's probably all for now because I've gone over time. The only other thing that I'll mention, and this is not my product, this is Gina Lincoln and the KLC's product, and it relates to the question that we had in the break, is that Gina's developed with the working group and a whole lot of people, developed a collaborative science on Kimberley saltwater country guide for researchers. And Stu put this up yesterday, and like Stu said, there's a lot of steps there on paper, but when you actually get into doing the work, things can flow fairly smoothly. I guess it's really a support tool to help to guide people through this collaborative research process. And it could be implemented in institutional training, or it could be done on an ad hoc sort of project basis, but we can probably talk about that more later.
We're just quickly going to load up the talk for the integrated management. We're going to swiftly move on to that. And we might sort of have some questions right at the end for the whole, because as I said before, some of your questions might be answered in the preceding presentations, because they do all wrap into a similar topic in terms of Indigenous engagement, working on country, integrated management. So the next presentation, we've asked Leah, who's the Marine Park Coordinator for the 80 Mile Beach Marine Park, to present with Dean, who's also part of the integrated management for the Roebuck Bay Marine Park. Unfortunately, Chris Nutt, who's the Marine Park Coordinator for the Roebuck Bay Marine Park, wasn't able to make it. But just to talk a little bit about how it works with this integrated management approach now that we're working between. There's the board, integrated management board, that tries to come up with consistent approach to how that works together. And Jen Munro from the Northern Kimberley Marine Park is also going to contribute to that, to just give you a flavour of how that process is coming together, because it's a brand new process, it's never been done before. So these guys are responsible for working through how to actually get this done to work much better together.
I might let the girls introduce themselves first. Obviously, everybody knows who I am. But
hi everyone. Today we're here to talk about working together on country for healthy country and marine park area management. My name's Leah Pearson. I'm the Marine Park Coordinator for 80 Mile Beach, and I work for Parks and Wildlife Service. Just to give you a bit of a background on the park that I work in, we have 4 joint management areas, which is really quite interesting, and then interesting in how you actually facilitate joint management on country, because this park is quite unique for that reason. Most of the time the marine parks have one joint management partner, and you've got an area that you're looking at. With the 80 Mile Beach Marine Park, we've got 4 different sets of cultural protocols that we're dealing with in the park, and it really is about a conversation that we're both having about trying to align the values of pretty much the Parks and Wildlife Service and also the traditional owners in this park. And you may think, how can that work? And really, we do actually have a common objective, and that's across all the marine parks as well. And that's to look at the protection of culture and environment for on-country protection. And it's a really important point because we are working to a common objective.
Hi everybody, I'm Jennifer Munro. I'm the Marine Park Coordinator for the North Kimberley Marine Park. We're pretty huge, we've got 1.8 million hectares. Currently we are in joint management with Ballingarra, and we've got the chair of our joint management body here today, Matthew Weiner. We are a lot newer to the joint management game for North Kimberley. So we obviously have a lot to learn from what's been happening in the other parks. But I'll pitch in with some insights where I can.
Thanks, Jen and Leah. I suppose just we wanted to sort of, with this multi-evidence-based approach, I thought it was a good opportunity to reflect on the joint management space and you know what we're, I suppose, coming up against, some of the challenges but successes in the Kimberley within the joint management space between traditional owner groups. Mindful that obviously, you know, there's those agreements are subtly different depending on which group. But I think it was sort of in the context and the flow of today's, you know, the best engagement with Indigenous groups, reflect on that a little bit with the joint management space up there. So Leah, you want to?
Sure.
Yep. No. So I suppose, let Leah introduce this quote.
So I guess we've got a joint management definition up here for you to read. It's very Western orientated, and I guess what we're looking at is two different sets of values coming together from the traditional owners and parks and wildlife. And while this is a very Western quote, we like policy procedure, we like research data, there is really a different way that the traditional owners tell their stories. It's really through what I've just kind of mentioned, the stories that they tell and how they impart knowledge is very different. And what we're actually, I guess, trying to do in the joint management space is really come together with a collaborative approach that integrates traditional ecological knowledge and Western science to achieve that on-country management goal. And I guess really what we should point out here is that we're in the really early stages of joint management. Joint management has really only just begun, and most of these arrangements have only really recently been negotiated, and we're in the early stages of implementation. So we're still learning, and we're still having those conversations and communication with each other so that we can clearly define how we move forward together with a common objective and a common goal. And it's really important that we establish that and the protocols that we're going to work to.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. There are obviously challenges, and obviously, in the joint management space now, the department's processes that was usually undertaken by the department has to be, I suppose, there needs to be some rethinking around the old standardized process around how the department undertakes its business. And one example of that is the monitoring and prioritization process of research. So technically, previously within the marine protected areas, the marine science branch within the department would undertake that process around what are they, I suppose, in the implementation of the marine park plan, how does the prioritization process get undertaken with the traditional owners. So we come up against that challenge this year, and I sort of put the challenge down to both Jen and Chris in regards to that monitoring prioritization process, that I wanted the traditional owners to be participating in that to reflect true joint management. So obviously that matrix and prioritization process is quite complex and it's very scientific speak. Thanks to Jen, she had a first crack at it and trying to break down the wording. Obviously language is a barrier here between the two groups. So breaking that down to, I suppose, be more palatable to the traditional owner groups in regards to the wording in that process. So bit of a toing and froing over the 6 months, we were able to redefine it to a standard that, I suppose Yawuru were quite happy with it and could go through that process. So, and it was quite ironic that after going through it with traditional owners and the department, at the end we had compatible outcomes. Water quality, nutrient, and seagrass were the key indicators that came out of the Yawuru side, and vice versa on the marine side. So, these things can work, but I think change takes time, and we just need to rethink about current processes and how they might suit traditional owners. So, so that I think wanted to reflect that is a multi-evidence-based approach towards a process that was technically undertaken by the marine or science branch. Yep, sure can.
Just to add something in there in terms of reworking the research and monitoring framework. As a social scientist, it was good fun to jump in and turn this highly scientific, fantastic framework into something that was a lot more workable on the ground and understandable for people from non-scientific backgrounds and different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So as Dean was saying, it was a good 6 months of back and forth and arguing over terminology and nuances and all kinds of exciting things. And we have got to a really good place with that. Yawuru's been through it. In North Kimberley, we've been through the research and monitoring prioritization process with the Ballingarra guys, and it's gone really well. Obviously, it's an iterative process. We'll be going through it again every couple of years as Western science and information about the Kimberley continues to build and develop, and also the Indigenous knowledge comes to the fore. And I just wanted to raise the point that we are still struggling with this framework is the integration of cultural values, or really getting the Indigenous component, how we can recognise that very special context of the Kimberley in what is originally a very strongly Western scientific framework. And that's something that we haven't addressed yet, and I think it will occupy us for a fair while to come. But just illustrates another one of those tensions of joint management. How do we get two essentially different worldviews to combine for the one outcome?
And this probably tells you why we need to do that research and monitoring prioritisation. Just to give you some context with what we're dealing with in the Kimberley, which most of you are probably aware of, but we do have 5 marine parks that are established, and we have a combined area of 3,379,432 hectares. And to give some context, that's 29% of WA's total coastal waters that we're managing. In that arrangement so far, we have 7 joint management arrangements with 6 traditional owner native title groups. So really that's where WAMSI has kicked in, and they have been fantastic in helping us direct our priorities, and also how we engage with our joint management partners. I think out of this process, it really highlights how we engage with the traditional owners and the cultural groups, not just ourselves as joint management partners, but how we as a collective engage with the Kimberley region. And really, I guess, what are we trying to achieve? And we're really looking at best practice Indigenous engagement for healthy country management, and we're really trying to look at a strategic approach on how we do our research and monitoring, because this translates into the on-ground management and the long-term management that as marine park coordinators and traditional owners we're dealing with. And I guess just to highlight maybe one of the issues that probably could come out of this is that we don't want to be working in silos as marine parks, and also with our joint management partners. It's been recognised that we really do need a collective approach across the Kimberley and how we're directing our priorities. So we really want to see that on-ground management being consistent across the marine parks, and how we move forward.
So I suppose there's 3 points there that we sort of wanted to touch on in regards to working together on country for healthy country and marine protected areas management. We'll just talk about a couple of those points, but strong relationships built on trust, respect and mutual understanding. Joint management represents a new era for collaborative management for conservation areas. It requires things to be done differently. Long-term collaborative partnerships are relationships that values and encourage accountability, transparency and discussion. So it's about that transparency process. The more we're engaged, the more transparent the process is. We don't become skeptical. So I think if a process that comes out of that engagement early, so traditional owners are involved in regards to the journey of what we're trying to achieve. Obviously, there needs to be significant time and effort required for partners to bridge gaps. To gain trust amongst each other, you have to really understand each other in the other's shoes and their process and what their intentions are. I suppose it requires that both partners be open in regards to their perceptions and what their expectations are in regards to joint management. So I think the processes need to be, and the timelines need to be sort of to allow that for the conversation to happen. So I think there needs to be some rethinking in regards to the process that was currently undertaken. Pretty timely, I think, because the Conservation Act, there's a review of the amendment of the Conservation Land Management Act to allow joint management to achieve between traditional owners. So I think it's timely that we can feed those products and those discussions back into the review with the state to try and, I suppose, better the future moving forward. And yep, you guys want to touch on some of those points, or?
And I'll just add in there that those relationships is how we move forward and how we do good management, and really having that trust and respect and spending that time to do that is really critical in the managing of these parks. And as researchers, I would encourage you right at the beginning of your process to engage with traditional owners. Our policies and procedures with Parks and Wildlife Services probably don't allow for that at this point in time, and we are working to improve on those engagement processes, but I would encourage you to do that. Moving on, learning by what we're doing. Working in this area, we often feel like there isn't a tried and tested route to follow, and in many ways this is true. So we need to remember that there will be some trial and error. We are going to make mistakes, but we're going to learn from them and we will be better for them. And it's how we move forward as well. And this should be okay. It's okay to do that. It's part of the process of learning and what we're doing in this space, as long as we're doing it in a respectful manner. Really not starting the processes with the answers already answered, but working through things to build where the starting point is. Don't think you already have from a marine park coordinator, it's about not making sure that I'm telling somebody. I'm sitting there and doing active listening and making sure that we're moving forward. And we really need to build a platform for resilience. And this will facilitate a better understanding of the way we research and engage with TOs and with Parks and Wildlife Service.
I think that's it. On country meetings, I suppose this is some of the processes I wanted to reflect in regards to changing the way we think. So obviously, I think this is the 80 Mile Beach crew here. On country, with some planning trips, management planning for the marine park, correct me if I'm wrong there? Yep. And managing country, just to try and reflect some of the great work the joint management rangers are doing. So it's about capacity, employment, and managing country. They're learning about the department's processes, but they're carrying their cultural values and obligations and rights. Some more, I suppose, some snapshot of some of the work the great work that the guys are doing in relation to protecting country. Keep going. One of the girls want to talk to this.
And to bring it home, just a snapshot slide here. This is taken from research that was done with Dhamma traditional owners a few years back. Basically what we want to convey with this slide is the larger the font of the word conveys a greater magnitude of times that theme or that word came up in discussions. So we're talking about joint management, Parks and Wildlife Services working together with traditional owners for joint management, and you're getting terms such as understanding, together on the same level, on country, trust, coming through as key themes. And these are basically values and themes that will underpin joint management moving forward.
Oh yeah, so acknowledgement to the joint management partners, some of them here today, Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attraction, WAMSI, and current and past staff, community members that have been involved in the planning and managing the joint management marine park. So thanks to all.
Thanks, guys. And I think it gives you an idea of the complexity of what's going on in the Kimberley. It's the first time it's been done in WA. So these guys are not only trying to work out in the Kimberley, but also trying to work out how to do this in Western Australia across the board. So we might hold questions just because time-wise. We're going to finish this session going into morning tea with. Yes, you're going to attend, and we're going to stop later. So we'll finish this section with Rebecca Dobbs talking about, and this is just a just talking about one of the other products that's coming out of the KISS program and how that's sort of feeding in to, you might have remembered the slide that I put up at the start of the session yesterday that talked about coming up with metrics that work for everyone, the similar metrics to be monitoring across country. And Bex looked a little bit more into what are those things that are being done on country and how can that work with Western Science when monitoring the same things and really empowering particularly Indigenous ranger groups to start monitoring and researching their own country, but in a way that's consistent with Western Science. And a lot of the stuff that's coming out of it is because there are Western scientists already working on country, already engaged with Indigenous groups and ranger groups and trying to educate them on how to do that.
Okay, thanks, Stu. Just to give you a little bit of a background, I'm employed through the University of Western Australia, but I'm actually based in Kununurra in the Kimberley region. I've been living there for the last 10 years. So leading into this project, I've obviously got a Western science focus. Initially, I'd spent a lot of time researching freshwater, and I've also had the opportunity to work with a number of these, the groups that worked within this project, trying to adapt Western science techniques for use by Indigenous rangers. So I sort of coordinate a program that does that for freshwater. And so as part of this project, I came across into saltwater monitoring, and I'll just... So I just put up here first why a regional framework. When the KISS working group first got together, they realised that there was a lot of work going on in the Kimberley, not only from all of the WAMSI research that was coming in, but also previous research and also previous monitoring and management that ranger groups were undertaking long before WAMSI came into the picture. And I think groups really realised that they wanted to share some of those experiences across groups. So that's why the importance of a regional framework. Different groups were working with different researchers, and some groups didn't have the opportunity to have access to those tools or the monitoring techniques that were being developed. So they saw that as being a really important reason to have a regional approach to monitoring. The second point was that groups were also collecting information. For example, they were collecting information on dugongs, turtles, migratory species, that they realised that in order to understand what was going on in their country, they needed to talk together and look at those values across the regional area. Also, I think these guys just brought up that interesting, not dilemma, but the approach at the moment that a lot of groups are actually going into joint management arrangements with the marine parks being developed. And they were being asked to, I suppose, sit at a table and start to talk about those things like priorities, what's important, what do you want to monitor. And so obviously in a joint management arrangement, you want to make sure that all stakeholders' aspirations are included in that. So by looking at a regional framework, the KISS working group really wanted to sort of develop one themselves so that they could start sitting at those tables and having those conversations with some information behind that. And some other opportunities from a regional framework, obviously the peak bodies such as the Kimberley Land Council, you can start to demonstrate some of the land and sea management outcomes at a broader scale, so management effectiveness of all of the great work that ranger groups do across the Kimberley, and also it was really important for the groups. So we're doing a lot of research in the Kimberley. We've got a lot of Indigenous knowledge about the Kimberley, but where do we need to build more capacity? Where's the capacity needed to make sure that we're using that information to actually have a look at whether we're being effective in our management? So some of the broader aims of this, of when I was asked to come on board to do the framework, was we really wanted to make sure that we built on existing work. There's a wealth of information out there and a wealth of knowledge, and the first thing that about 6 of the 7 Indigenous groups that we were working with have healthy country plans or cultural management plans. So these plans outline traditional owner aspirations for looking after and managing country. The healthy country plans are based on a Nature Conservancy's conservation action planning, and this is a sort of best practice process. And so the groups already have a process in place at the local scale, a lot of them. So I wanted to make sure that we built on this work for a regional scale. And the way we went about that, we also wanted to review what were the current monitoring methods that groups were actually using. There's a lot of methods out there, but were groups using them? Were they effective? Are groups using them to answer the questions that they would like to answer at a local scale? And the third aim was for us in this case study. It was only a short project, but at the same time that we were out there, we wanted to make sure that we tested and identified what the gaps were in the framework. So that the group moving forward, this framework will be something that we, if implemented moving forward into the future, we wanted to know where do we need to increase the capacity of groups to be able to roll out this framework or implement the framework, but also how can we get this framework to help start to drive some of those research questions and the research being undertaken. So for anybody who's been involved in monitoring, you'll see that this is just a very common adaptive management cycle. It's all about, so this is the framework itself. I'll just give you a quick overview. So very common adaptive management cycle. You identify what's important, you identify what's threatening those things that are important. You prioritise based on that, those threats and your values. You go out and monitor to see what's changing in those values. You assess your monitoring and analyse your monitoring results, and that's then used to inform your ongoing monitoring and management. So but it's the process, it's actually the detail within the steps where we were able to make sure that the framework captured the unique features in the Kimberley. One of the things that we really wanted to do about the framework was make sure that there's a lot of work, as I said, at this local scale. So a lot of frameworks can come in and put another structure over what groups are already doing. And Ranger Groups monitoring is only one small part of what they do on an everyday work plan. So we wanted to make sure that this local scale, what they were doing at the local scale, could feed into the regional framework, but also that the regional framework could feed into and support the local scale monitoring that was going on. So I'll just quickly go through, as part of this, as I said, we were able to trial through the KISP as a case study, and what we've done is this, because it's a regional framework for the rangers, we developed tools along the way to help them with implementation. So at step 1, identifying the values. So what we were able to do through, Beau mentioned, went to, and a number of the talks mentioned, we had workshops on country with traditional owners. So we initially reviewed all of the healthy country plans. We went out and confirmed that with the groups on country and with the traditional owners, and we're able to categorise at a regional scale the saltwater values into 6 categories. And you'll see that cultural practices is on the left-hand side there, and that's to sort of illustrate that cultural practices are intertwined and interrelated to each of the other values. They're not separated from, but they have to be considered when considering the other values. And so you'll see the sort of things that, sort of things as saltwater food and resources, conservation targets. So the groups can still consider conservation targets as being important, but also the inclusion of significant areas and places, livelihoods, and saltwater country. Then the next, we then looked at threats across the region, and you'll see here under each of the categories that we've been able to identify those threats that are sort of more common to Western science, so climate change, mining, etc. But it's really important that for a regional framework that we considered those things that the traditional owners saw as being threats to saltwater country and also these values, which you'll see here. So things such as lack of access to country, so those things that impact on their cultural practices, and stop them from undertaking cultural practices, are actually as important as those things, those threats such as mining and climate change. The next step of the process was about prioritisation, and although that we couldn't get all the groups together and undertake what would be a best practice prioritisation process across all of the groups, we're able to use the healthy country planning process, which actually through the conservation action planning, the groups actually have prioritised at a local scale and also developed objectives and strategies. So what we did is we looked at these objectives and strategies across the region, and we're able to take those, we summarised those that were those common across the region, but also then reduce that down based on those that would actually benefit from looking at a regional scale. So actually monitoring or managing at a regional scale. So and the reason that we put this up as a tool for groups is because and if you saw from that list before, we've got this overwhelming values and things that are important to people, but we can't go out and monitor all of those things. It's unrealistic to think that we have that time or money, and so by actually looking at the objectives, we can start to narrow down implementation of the framework and where do we need to focus that attention on our objectives and strategies. And so you'll see here that one of the most common objectives here about maintaining cultural practices and meeting obligations to country, by actually managing for Objective 5, you're actually having positive outcomes for all of your values. Also, also you'll see here just Objective 1 that traditional owners, one of the objectives of traditional owners have access to Western science, cultural and Indigenous knowledge about plants, animals and culture. And this is coming back to Beau's multiple evidence-based groups are already thinking like that. They want the best available traditional knowledge, but also the best available Western science in order to help them to make decisions about management. I'll just go forward. So in order to, if we were going to, for this framework, for local monitoring to inform regional scale monitoring, the framework, we did a review of what was going on at the local scale. And what we found that there was an overwhelming focus at the moment on monitoring the status of values. So groups are spending a lot of time monitoring what's happening to those values. Are they going up? Are they going down? But unfortunately not a lot of monitoring of management effectiveness. Like that management effectiveness was limited. So we're collecting and taking on that information about what's happening to these values, but we're not making the comparison to whether or not the management actions that we're taking are being effective. So we're not using that information at the moment. And I suppose there are a number of reasons that, and this is quite common, obviously, in any monitoring realm, where, and so it's not just I suppose, isolated to this circumstance, but a number of reasons that we think that this is that different groups are at different stages of the conservation action planning process. So the healthy country plans are a really good way of forward about what people find important and what people see as being things that they would like to protect and manage. But I suppose the complexity of that implementation of the CAP process has meant that people are actually stopping at that point. They're actually just going out and now measuring all of those things that are important. And also, another reason for that is we've had this significant focus on developing Western science techniques. So as researchers have been going out and working with the groups, they've actually been adapting or developing Western science techniques for groups to undertake monitoring. But rather than focusing and taking a step back and saying, okay, what's the question that we actually want to answer with these tools and techniques? Yes, we've got an overwhelming number of techniques and tools now, but how can we use those techniques and tools to answer those questions that that the groups want to know at a local scale? And also, obviously, because funding is driven by external sources and it's focused on research. And I think that that's, so it's not that it's focused on research, sorry, it's focused on questions that are coming externally from the group. So it's research questions that researchers and I suppose people outside the region would like to answer. And those things are really important because they can help, they can help inform what the groups can do at that local scale and monitoring. But without a regional framework, this is another reason you really need a regional framework, is because if you don't have that regional framework, then you don't have this way forward about how to start driving some of those research questions so that research is actually helping you to answer your management questions. And I suppose, so once we started breaking it down, we've developed a number of tools for the groups, so I'll go over these briefly, so we're really trying to get groups to start thinking about what is the question that they want to answer. And to help do that, we've developed some conceptual models, and these conceptual models give the opportunity to incorporate not only ecological attributes, but also cultural attributes, and so groups can start from the ground up and start thinking about what it is that's important at the local scale, so we know what we need to look at this regional scale. So they're the conceptual models. And one of the things we did is said, okay, there's a lot of those methods out there, so we've pulled together these methods, and rather than actually having a framework that specifies that you definitely have to use a method, we've gone with a toolbox approach. So the toolbox approach is by having a look across the whole region, looking at the monitoring that people are doing, the research that they're doing, and the tools out there. This is only a snapshot of the toolbox. So the toolbox, as you can see, it provides groups within the categories that you saw before, of those things, those values. So within saltwater's resources, and then it goes into more detail. For example, turtles. The toolbox is question driven, so it gets groups to think about what it is, the questions that they want to answer first, what tools are available. And one thing I forgot to mention before is that we really need to make sure we're all working together on this KISS project. And one of the things that Beau was producing at the same time was this multiple evidence-based approach. And we really needed to make sure that this framework incorporated a multiple evidence-based approach. So what it does is it gives people the opportunity to use, so you'll see here, they can look at the question, the tool, and then you'll come down here, and the second part of the toolbox explains about the tool. So the groups can access what the actual monitoring tool is, what's being measured, is there a recording method, is it using an eye tracker, is it using sheets that you can access from other groups or researchers? Who was it trialled and developed with? So has it actually been trialled and developed in the Kimberley? Is it so that people can actually see if those tools are relevant? And also here, also what's really important, and I'll talk about this quickly in a minute, is this analysis. So how do groups analyse this information? Are there tools available to analyse the information? And the toolbox itself, you can see it has, what it also does is it gives the opportunity for, what we've built into it is that it's got Western science monitoring techniques, but also local Indigenous techniques as well for monitoring information. We've then built that into electronically, the groups can now access this information so that they can go in, and for each of say, saltwater resources, turtles, they now know that this is a boat-based surveys, and whether or not there's field managed recording method analysis tools. So it's brought all of that information together for groups to access. So what are the benefits of the toolbox? We're able to align the toolbox as a multiple evidence-based approach. Groups get to choose from Indigenous knowledge or Western science-based approaches. It provides a distinction between research monitoring and long-term monitoring. So that was a real, there's a lot of monitoring that groups are undertaking in the region, but what is it that's long-term monitoring, and what is it that's actually answering just a question that we need to know right now? And also making sure that groups aren't reinventing techniques. I think Stu mentioned yesterday that seagrass has a number of techniques, but at the moment we only have, from Western science techniques, most of the values that we're looking at only have one technique at the moment. So before groups go out and develop a new technique, have a look at that one, see if it works, see if they can use it. And also it allows them to monitor management effective, not just what's happening with values. And I just wanted to quickly touch on this last point, which was the assessment phase. In the reports, we've given there's some monitoring and evaluation case studies that we've given where groups who've had access to resources have been able to undertake sort of analysis of their work. But I think one of the important things about the toolbox to note that only 2 of all of the tools that we captured within the toolbox actually have analysis tools that rangers can actually use to analyse their data. So what's happening is a lot of information is being collected out there, but as you can imagine, that information is sitting there at the moment and it's actually not being used. And you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. Tools aren't available, the capacity of the groups, I mean, they're just the amount of work that they have to do across their region is enormous, and so those are the sorts of things where we need to start building capacity. And an example here, it's really hard to see, I'm sorry about that, but really it's just some techniques. This is in freshwater, but just to show you that there are some techniques that we've been trying to start developing, where this is data that's taken from that groups collect in the field. They cut and paste the data directly into a spreadsheet, and it produces these graphs. And so the graphs moving from red to green. So we worked with the groups about what colours we need to use in the graphs. But as you can see, it actually it's a visual way of groups being able to easily have a look at the first cut of the monitoring data that they're collecting, and then there's data that sits behind this that groups can then, if they need more help, they can access researchers. But they're able to collect data, look at the data, and start to feed this into some management straight away without having to have access to researchers all the time. So just finally, I suppose the key outcomes were we were able to develop best practice framework, accounting for the unique features in the Kimberley. We had to ensure that it incorporated a multiple evidence-based approach. The approach, as you would have seen, it considers salt country not only as a marine ecosystem, but it's as a complex ecological, social and economic system. And you need to include those things, otherwise they get left off by the wayside. The KISP case study, we've been able to provide important information for long-term implications of rolling out the framework. So within the reports, okay, where do we need capacity building? Where is investment required? So especially groups that are developing, or researchers that are developing techniques, can now go to that toolbox and see where there are tools needed, where groups need more work, where they need more help. And basically, yeah, implementation of the framework will allow traditional owners to better visualise a picture of ecosystem health. That incorporates both Indigenous knowledge and Western science. And finally, so I just wanted to say, we forgot to say before that we'll have a sheet up here. These reports will be publicly available, but if anybody would like access to them and would like us to send the copy, if you just come and leave your email address and you can let us know and we'll send something to you.
Thanks, Beck. Appreciate that. The final report's being completed at the moment, and that will be available online on the WAMSI website as well.